We live in a world that, well, fiercely defends the idea, the abstract right to free expression. But, we're constantly grappling with the fallout, aren't we? The polarization, the disinformation, just the sheer noise sometimes that drowns out real dialogue.
It's a constant tension, a really fundamental one.
Exactly. So how do you protect that right? The ability to voice dissent, even fundamental dissent, while also, safeguarding social harmony, keeping things stable. What's the actual practical blueprint for, let's say, constructive criticism?
That's probably one of the oldest and deepest political dilemmas out there. It's really about making freedom work, making it functional. And the core idea, the principle we see again and again in the historical sources we're looking at today, is that free expression has to be fundamentally linked with responsibility, with respect for institutions, and importantly, a commitment to truth, verifiable truth.
Responsibility and truth. Okay.
Yeah, without that kind of structure, that definition, freedom can just, it often spirals into chaos. It defeats itself.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is a deep dive into a collection of historical documents, specifically 10 cases we've numbered 86 through 95. And these detail a really foundational framework for civic dialogue. And this is way more than just theory, right? These are records of specific actions, things that happened over 14 centuries ago that set down these, timeless principles for expression that actually builds the society up rather than constantly threatening to, tear it down.
Exactly. We're looking at an early, quite detailed framework of political thinking rooted in Islamic jurisprudence that defined both the, let's say, practical boundaries and the huge value of constructive criticism.
Right.
So for you, the listener, this offers some really invaluable insight, I think, into how early societies, and, by extension, modern ones too, can balance that need for open expression with the need for loyalty, for consensus, and ultimately for political and social cohesion.
And what's really fascinating to me is the level of detail in these sources, how specific they are about how this balance was achieved. We're not just dealing with vague philosophical statements here.
Not at all.
We're looking at actual institutional mechanics, things designed to address those tensions, those inherent conflicts between free speech and responsibility, between openness and, defined respect, and between criticism and that foundational loyalty.
These 10 cases really do provide a kind of roadmap, and we can walk through the structure they laid out. First, drawing that line between dissent and actual division.
Yeah.
Second, building the political architecture for inclusion, making sure people could participate.
Okay.
Third, showing the real power of diverse input, bringing different views in. And finally, creating the mechanisms for operational transparency and trust, making it work day to day.
All right, let's dive into that first part then. Section 1, drawing the line, distinguishing dissent from division. Cases 86 and 87. Let's start right at that maybe the most dangerous point of political tension. When does healthy criticism become sedition? When does disagreement cross over into genuine physical division? This seems to be where case 86 comes in, focusing on dissent and loyalty assessment.
Yeah, and what's immediately striking here is the recognition that internal debate is, it's healthy. But internal fracturing, splitting apart, that's seen as fatal. The sources are very explicit about the critical need to distinguish between dissent that strengthens governance, by refining policy.
Right, making things better.
And actions that fundamentally destroy the community's unity by attacking the basic social contract itself.
Okay, so looking into the details, the prophet, peace be upon him, is documented welcoming people who pointed out flaws or mistakes, or maybe suggested different strategies.
Yes, absolutely, openly.
Yeah. But if that critique turned into an overt act of rebellion, like an attempt to actually fracture the political body or incite violence against the state that was rejected, completely, sometimes with pretty severe consequences, the focus in the record seems to always be on the action taken and its intended effect on the state's coherence.
Precisely. And this is crucial. It's not about banning unpopular opinions. It's about banning violent or seditious acts. The challenge, of course, for any leadership was, and still is, drawing that line fairly without giving into the temptation of just labeling all inconvenient criticism as sedition.
Which is always the danger, isn't it?
Always. But the historical framework provided a safeguard, at least in theory, by grounding the definition of sedition strictly in actions, overt actions that threaten the collective safety or unity of the community, not just opinions that, might offend the leadership.
But who ultimately got to draw that line? That's the core challenge, surely. Isn't the leadership always tempted, as you said, to label inconvenient dissent as sedition, just to suppress legitimate criticism? How did this framework actually try to prevent that misuse of power?
Well, it was theoretically prevented and ideally practically prevented by a couple of things. One was institutional transparency, which we'll get to later, and the other was the widely accepted principle of shura, or consultation.
Ah, consultation.
Yeah. If the decision-making process was relatively open, it was just harder for the leadership to arbitrarily declare dissent illegal without looking tyrannical in the eyes of the community. Plus, the type of dissent mattered. Criticism offered in a public forum aimed at reform, that was treated differently from, say, secret plotting aimed at overthrow.
So the intent and the method mattered hugely.
Hugely. The lesson here for, the modern learner is profound. Criticism, when it's constructive, operates within the system. It seeks reform, improvement under the accepted rule of law. Rebellion, by definition, tries to overthrow or fracture the system outside the bounds of law.
The stability this creates seems really compelling. It suggests a system designed to tolerate even extreme disagreement, provided the basic framework of the state itself is respected. And that ties so directly into modern legal frameworks, doesn't it? We see this play out constantly in the distinction between protected free speech and, say, sedition laws.
Absolutely.
You're free to call for a leader's impeachment, maybe, but you're not free to plot to overthrow the government by force. That line between protected expression and illegal anti-state action, it's ancient, it's clearly defined here, and it's absolutely essential for any functioning state that wants both liberty and stability.
It really is a political constant. If a society can't effectively tell the difference between productive dissent and destructive division, it basically faces two bad outcomes. Either a rigid autocracy that allows no voice at all, or a rapid collapse into chaos. Case 86 insists on defining the first to protect against the latter.
Okay, so that sets the boundary. Now, moving into Case 87, we kind of shift gears quite dramatically. We go from defining the limit of dissent to actively embracing disagreement. This case deals with the protection of dissenting opinions, showing the need to actually hear voices of disagreement patiently, even when they challenge the leadership directly on, say, strategy.
Yes, and what's really compelling about Case 87 is the specific high-stakes historical example it uses. The companions openly disagreeing during military strategy discussions, specifically right before the Battle of Uhud.
Ah, Uhud?
The decision on whether to fight outside the walls of Medina or stay inside was subject to open, pretty heated debate. And this wasn't some, philosophical chat in a quiet room. This was an open, strategic difference of opinion at a moment of existential threat.
And crucially, this open challenge, this strategic disagreement, it wasn't treated as like a disciplinary issue, was it? Or a sign of weakness or disloyalty by the leadership?
No, not at all. In fact, the sources highlight this insight that difference of opinion is presented not as a challenge or a weakness, but often as mercy, Rama, a positive force.
Oh, mercy. That's a strong word. Why a mercy?
Well, the term implies that diversity of thought is actually a gift. Why? Because it assumes that having more minds consider more angles, including the dissenting ones, will ultimately produce a better collective decision than just a single, unchallenged viewpoint, no matter how wise that single leader might be.
Okay.
In the Uhud case, the final decision was indeed to fight outside the city, even though there was strong dissent against it. But the dissent itself forced the proponents of that strategy to really rigorously defend their choice, and maybe even prepare for contingencies that the opposition raised.
So the argument from the dissenters actually served to stress test the final plan. It forced the leadership to check its assumptions, defend its choices publicly. That foundational tolerance for strategic dissent, it mirrors exactly what we consider essential for good governance today, things like the adversarial system in law, for instance.
Absolutely. Or think about how a modern Supreme Court works, where a dissenting opinion is published right alongside the majority one.
Right, it's part of the record.
The dissent doesn't invalidate the law, but it strengthens the whole judicial system. It forces the majority opinion to be as airtight as possible, and it provides a framework for future challenges if that law turns out to be flawed down the line. This kind of institutionalized opposition isn't just allowed, it's often required in many democratic settings because it's seen as the engine of, well, superior collective intelligence.
So the lesson from these first two cases seems simple, but it's incredibly profound, isn't it? Draw a bright line against actions that fracture the community through violence or sedition. That's Case 86.
Yeah.
But then institutionally embrace and protect the intellectual and political differences that enrich it. That's Case 87.
Define the limits of acceptable behavior, absolutely. But within those limits, ensure the maximum amount of free thought isn't just tolerated, but actively encouraged as a political asset.
Okay, that brings us really neatly into the practical side, the implementation. Because it's one thing to say philosophically, oh, I value your opinion. It's quite another to actually build the physical and political infrastructure to make sure that opinion is heard, weighted fairly, and systematically, integrated into how things are run.
Exactly.
And this seems to be the focus of cases 88, 89, and 91, the architecture of participation.
This is where we really move from ethics into political engineering, you could say. Case 88 deals with standards for inclusive political participation. And the core concept here is the need for a fair, genuinely open framework for civic involvement that overcomes those inherent political and social frictions.
And this case feels absolutely foundational for political legitimacy, especially in a new state, being forged from really diverse groups. The specific historical detail it mentions is how political voice was designed to be inclusive, ensuring that both the migrants, the muhajirun, who were often displaced, maybe economically vulnerable.
Yes, they left everything behind.
And the local residents, the Ansar, who were the established property owners, the political majority had an equal say in community affairs.
And we really can't overstate how significant that was. We're not just talking about two groups of people. We're talking about two groups with massively different historical power structures, different economic standings. The Ansar had made huge sacrifices, giving up land resources, sharing power to host the Muhajirun.
Right.
So there was enormous potential there for resentment, or worse, for the systemic disenfranchisement of the newcomers who might have been seen as, indebted or just temporary residents.
And yet, the structure demanded parity. It required the governing body to consciously, deliberately neutralize that inherent imbalance. That's a huge principle. The lesson seems to be that political voice has to be inherently and demonstrably inclusive to be seen as legitimate.
Absolutely.
If you start restricting participation based on origin or economic status or historical background, the whole structure immediately loses credibility and you risk internal conflict.
It's essentially the historical basis for modern constitutional guarantees of equal voting rights, irrespective of your background or origin within a state. When you look at any modern nation struggling with integrating new populations or ensuring a voice for indigenous groups, you're basically seeing a failure to apply the lesson of Case 88. That effort to ensure inclusion wasn't just a nice idea. It was a deliberate, sophisticated political act needed to keep a new, diverse community stable.
Okay, let's move to Case 89 then. Institutionalizing community governance involvement. This seems to move beyond who gets to speak to how that speaking is organized and made reliable.
Yeah.
The concept here is that public participation has to be institutionalized, not just left to chance or, the whim of the leader.
Right. Ad hoc input is just too fragile. If getting heard depends on an individual citizen happening to have a good relationship with the leader or maybe just being loud enough to grab attention, then, 99% of the population is probably never going to be heard.
Yeah.
The sources indicate that the prophet, peace be upon him, actively encouraged people to formally share their concerns, their input, in dedicated known community gatherings. Sometimes these were held specifically for consultation.
So this wasn't just like catching the leader in the street after prayers.
No.
This was a dedicated, structured time and place, a formalized channel for input. And I think this is where many modern organizations, maybe even governments, sometimes fall short. They might say they're open to feedback, but if they don't create an actual reliable system, a formal mechanism, a regular town hall meeting, a consistent consultation period, then the voice of the people ends up relying on luck or, worse, privileged access.
It creates a system where the governed know explicitly when and how their voice can be heard, and maybe when decisions related to that input will be made. The lesson from Case 89 is really that for governance to be truly responsive, truly legitimate, it has to actively create sustained, known systems to listen. The system itself grants the right, not just the goodwill of the leader.
Could you elaborate just a bit on that difference between formal and ad hoc input in this context? What did that formality actually achieve?
Well, formality achieves several things: documentation, accountability, and reliability. When input is gathered formally, it has to be documented somehow.
Right, it's recorded.
Exactly. Then the leadership can be held accountable later for actually considering that input when the policy decision is eventually announced. If the process is just ad hoc, a conversation here, someone shouting there, it can easily be forgotten, dismissed as irrelevant, or even claimed later that it never happened. Formal input elevates the citizen's voice from just a suggestion to a required piece of the decision-making puzzle.
Okay, that's clear. Now, skipping slightly ahead maybe, but it connects directly to this idea of legitimacy. Case 91, securing and protecting political rights.
Yes, this case really just hammers home the point that affirming and guaranteeing political rights isn't optional for governmental legitimacy, it's non-negotiable. The sources highlight the public, explicit affirmation of the equality of community members in governance and their established rights to provide input. This isn't treated as just, a philosophical preference or a courtesy. It's framed as a necessary political tool to solidify the social contract between the rulers and the ruled.
So, defined rights aren't just feel-good statements on a piece of paper. They are the enforceable foundation upon which trust and legitimacy are actually built. If the governed know their political rights, their access, their input, their equality are explicitly protected, they're far more likely to accept the authority of the governing body, even when they strongly disagree with specific decisions it makes.
It creates a predictable framework for acceptable political action. If you know you have the secured right to speak, to consult, and to have your input counted fairly, even if you're ultimately outvoted on an issue, you're more likely to accept the outcome because the process itself was fair, transparent, and defined by established rules or laws.
Right.
And this is the core function of constitutional political freedoms in any modern state, isn't it? They cement that relationship between the governing and the governed, ensuring that power stays tethered to a common, agreed-upon framework of guaranteed rights.
Conversely, what happens when rights are not clearly defined or secured? What's the consequence highlighted here?
Well, then the governed are left entirely at the mercy of the ruler's mood or their whims. Uncertainty takes over, input becomes purely transactional, maybe dependent on bribery or driven by fear. And the only reliable form of political action might eventually become rebellion because there's simply no faith left in the system's ability to deliver change peacefully. Case 91 provides the antidote. Define the rights, secure them publicly, and legitimize the whole governance process through that act.
All right, moving on then. Let's look at some specific historical moments that dramatically showed the value of dissent, especially when it led to measurable, better outcomes for the whole community. Case 90 is a classic example. Recognition of constructive dissent, framed around that really pivotal, high-tension historical moment at Hudaybiyah.
Yes, Hudaybiyah. This is perhaps one of the most instructive moments cited in the sources. It really speaks to that core concept that respect must be given to voices that challenge the leadership, aiming for reform or improvement, even when that challenge questions a decision made by the highest authority. At Hudaybiyah, the terms of the treaty negotiated by the Prophet, peace be upon him, with the Meccans seemed, well, on the surface, incredibly disadvantageous, humiliating even to the Muslim community at that time.
Can you describe the tension there? Because I think it's vital to understanding why the dissent was so passionate, so raw.
Absolutely. The community had traveled a long, hard distance intending to perform the pilgrimage. They were prepared for potential conflict, and then they were presented with treaty terms that seemed to concede almost every point of pride and principle.
Like what specifically?
Well, for example, one clause required them to refer to their leader, the prophet, not by the title they used, Messenger of God, but simply by his personal name, a title acceptable to the Meccans. More critically, perhaps, was the clause stating that any Meccan who fled to Medina seeking refuge had to be returned, while any Muslim who fled to Mecca was not guaranteed safe return. It seemed to accept an inherent spiritual and political inequality. This caused deep shock, confusion, and frustration among the companions.
And the companions, figures like Umar ibn al-Khattab specifically, expressed profound, really raw disagreement. They were undeniably loyal, these figures, yet they challenged the terms directly, feeling they were giving up far too much dignity, too much strategic ground. But the sources highlight, importantly, that they did so respectfully. They engaged in open questioning of the decision, even though their frustration was clearly palpable.
And the depth of that established loyalty is what allowed the critique to happen without shattering the community. Because their core loyalty wasn't in question, the criticism could be heard as sincere concern, not as sedition. And the deep insight here, I think, is that while the leadership clearly had a strategic, long-term vision, that treaty's cessation of hostilities actually allowed for a massive expansion of Islamic influence and eventually led to the peaceful conquest of Mecca.
So it worked out strategically in the end.
It did, massively. But the respectful challenge in the moment was still seen as essential. It was taken seriously, it was processed, And ultimately, it showed that criticism, when framed constructively by loyal members, forces leadership to articulate their potentially superior long-term vision, even if it feels painful or inconvenient in the short term.
But wait, if the leadership's decision was ultimately validated by history, doesn't that mean the dissenters were, well, wrong in their assessment?
Yeah.
If so, why respect their dissent at all in that moment?
That's the critical nuance, isn't it? The dissenters were perhaps strategically incorrect in the short-term assessment, but they were arguably ethically correct in demanding accountability and a rational explanation for what felt like a painful, compromising decision. Respecting their dissent validated their participation in the process. It ensured that when the leadership was ultimately proven right by events, the community accepted that outcome not through blind obedience, but through a renewed, validated trust in the leader's long-term wisdom and strategy. The criticism served a functional purpose. It acted as a political pressure valve, and it was a proof of concept for the leadership's ability to handle internal disagreement constructively.
You know, this resonates so deeply with modern civic life, I think. Think about constructive journalism or responsible civic activism, the kind that identifies a real failure, maybe in infrastructure or policy, not just to score political points, but to present data and propose an alternative solution. They aim to fix the system, not just attack the people running it. That underlying respect for the structure, even while demanding radical reform, seems to be the key takeaway from who they be.
It really is the difference between a critique that says, look, your policy here is structurally unsound, and here's the data showing why it will likely fail in 3 years, which is constructive, versus one that focuses purely on personal attacks or just immediate emotional outrage. Both might point to a problem, but only the first one offers a path towards a solution and maintains the necessary respect for the dialogue and the political body itself.
Okay, now let's turn to Case 93, safeguarding diverse political expression. This brings us back to the concept of diversity, but it seems to take it a step further than just inclusion. It requires actively respecting and protecting the diversity of specific political views within the community.
Yes, this case establishes quite a high bar for tolerance, actually. The specific detail here is that even outright critics, individuals who were known to disagree strongly with the leadership's policies or approach, were explicitly allowed to speak and, crucially, retain their place within the social fabric.
What defined the boundary here, then? If the sources say even outright critics were allowed to speak, what was the caveat? What was the line they couldn't cross?
The caveat, and this brings us right back to the principles in Case 86, was that their speech could not be actively harmful to the community structure itself.
Oh, okay.
So in practice, this generally meant no incitement to violence, no defamation designed to permanently ruin someone's reputation without any proof, and no actions calculated to actually dissolve the unity of the community. Political critique, even harsh critique, was protected. Personal attack designed to destroy and sedition aimed at fracture were not.
So this implies a conscious decision by the leadership to tolerate voices they fundamentally disagreed with. Not just putting up with them, but maybe viewing the existence of diverse political views not just as a necessary evil, but as a net asset.
Exactly. The lesson seems clear. Diversity of views enriches governance and decision-making by forcing the leadership to consider varied perspectives that they might otherwise completely overlook.
How does it enrich? What's the mechanism?
It builds resilience. A governing body that only ever hears echoes of its own opinions becomes fragile. It's prone to catastrophic blind spots because it lacks, peripheral vision. When you allow diverse political expression, you are essentially stress testing your policies against the toughest counter-arguments available, often before the policy is even fully implemented. You're getting free, high-quality external auditing of your political strategy, in a sense.
And that, of course, is the historical bedrock of so many modern constitutional systems. It's the principle underpinning freedom of the press, the functioning of multi-party political systems, where the very act of having a structured, loyal opposition ensures that governance is constantly under external review and remains accountable to a wide range of opinions. And the idea is that this makes the resulting governance stronger overall. It formalizes that adversarial process for the benefit of the state itself. Okay, so we've established the ethical boundaries, dissent versus division, and the necessary political structure, inclusive rights. Now we need to look at the practical, day-to-day operations that actually sustain trust over the long haul. How do you move from a philosophy of free expression to a sustainable, functioning reality? This seems to be covered in cases 92, 94, and 95, the actual mechanics of trust.
Exactly. This section is really all about the practical mechanics, making the people's voice reliable, making the government's actions transparent, and ensuring fairness in representation. Case 92 focuses specifically on creating citizen participation mechanisms, establishing dedicated, repeatable channels to sustain continuous citizen input.
And the sources list three key mechanisms here, which sound highly operational, very structured: petitioning, formal consultation, and specific feedback systems.
Yeah, this is quite a sophisticated administrative structure for its time. And think about the distinction between those three. Just relying on ad hoc voices, we said, is insufficient for real policy influence. These three mechanisms represent distinct institutional pathways designed to handle different types of input systematically.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. What exactly did petitioning involve, and how did it differ from, say, consultation?
Petitioning was typically the mechanism for addressing individual grievances or maybe aggregating a specific shared public concern that required a formal answer from the governing body. It likely required some structure, maybe signatures, a clear statement of the issue, a designated recipient. It was essentially the historical equivalent of filing a formal request for redress or perhaps a call for legislative action on a very specific issue.
Okay, like bringing a specific problem to attention.
And formal consultation. Consultation, or shura as we mentioned, was more proactive. It was often a mandatory mechanism for seeking input before a major decision was finalized, especially decisions involving things like war, peace, or significant legal changes. This often required the leadership to involve key figures, senior companions, tribal representatives, military commanders. The key was that leadership was often legally or customarily bound to seek that input before acting.
So it was built into the pre-decision process. And finally, feedback systems.
Feedback systems seem to have been more continuous and perhaps retrospective. They allowed citizens to provide structured input after a policy was implemented, reporting on its effects, its successes, its failures. This ensures the policy loop gets closed, right? And it ensures governance is agile enough to potentially correct course quickly if something isn't working as intended.
Right.
The lesson is really clear. If you don't build the specific sustainable pathway, whether it's petition, consultation, or feedback, the water of public opinion just won't flow reliably into the policy. Like, it'll just pool up somewhere else, maybe turn stagnant.
Yeah, a government that relies solely on, I don't know, Twitter outrage or media headlines for feedback is probably an unstable government in the long run.
Probably.
A stable one relies on these kinds of established, systematic channels, just like those outlined in Case 92. It makes participation a right enforced by the system's design, not just a privilege granted by chance or proximity to power.
Absolutely. And the lack of these formal systems almost guarantees that the only people who are consistently heard are the already powerful, the privileged, or perhaps just the extremely angry. Stable governance requires predictable input channels for the whole spectrum of society.
Okay, let's move to Case 94, which addresses something fundamental and often overlooked when we talk about trust: standards for administrative openness and transparency.
The core concept here is pretty radical, actually, even by some modern standards. The idea that governance requires proactive, voluntary transparency to function effectively and, crucially, to retain public trust. And the specific detail cited is highly compelling. The prophet, peace be upon him, is documented sharing records and even treaties publicly, making administrative actions known to all community members.
Wait, sharing high-level state documents, like the actual text of treaties, publicly? That sounds, well, radical, as you said.
Yeah.
Doesn't that create a huge security risk? Or maybe undermine the diplomatic leverage of the governing body? How is it justified?
That's a completely legitimate challenge, and undoubtedly there were risks. However, the sources seem to suggest that the leadership, in this specific context, weighed the potential risk of diplomatic exposure against the guaranteed damage of internal mistrust and speculation.
Ah, okay. The internal threat was seen as greater.
In the context of a new state being built fundamentally on trust and consensus among diverse groups, internal legitimacy was paramount. The lesson seems to be that openness acts as the most effective preventative measure against internal mistrust, rumor, and speculation. When people can see the receipts, so to speak, the actual text of treaties, the records of major decisions, they are far less likely to assume corruption or hidden agendas are at play.
That's phenomenal, really. We're talking about public disclosure of official state documents, potentially sensitive diplomatic documents being shared with the general public. Because secrecy, well, it just breeds cynicism, doesn't it? Especially when resources are scarce and the political stakes are high.
Exactly. When the governed are kept in the dark about how decisions are being made or what agreements have been signed on their behalf, that informational vacuum is instantly filled by rumor, by accusation, often leading to instability. This historical practice of public record sharing is, in essence, the direct ancestor, the underlying principle behind modern Freedom of Information laws, or FOIA requests. Transparency isn't presented here as merely an ethical bonus. It's framed as the default mode required for political legitimacy and stability. It gives the community a sense of ownership over the state's actions.
Okay, finally, you arrive at Case 95, ensuring equitable political voice and unity. Now, we touched on this earlier with the inclusion of the Muhajirun and Ansar, but here the focus seems to be specifically on balancing representation across different groups as a continuous administrative act, something needed to maintain social harmony over time.
Yes, this case really reinforces the absolute necessity of institutional balance. It wasn't enough to merely allow the Ansar, the established locals, the majority, and the Muhajirun, the newer minority group, to participate. The principle highlighted is that they had to be consulted equally in community decision-making, even when it might have been numerically simpler or politically easier just to rely on the majority's voice.
That's a critical distinction, isn't it? It moves beyond simple inclusion, just making sure everyone's in the room, to active equalization, making sure their voices carry similar institutional weight. It acknowledges that in a diverse society, you can't always just count heads and rely purely on majority rule for legitimacy or stability. You have to consciously ensure that the perspective of the less powerful group, or the minority group, is given similar institutional weight and attention as the dominant groups, specifically to maintain social unity.
Precisely. The sources suggest the goal wasn't just a fair process in the abstract. It was sustained unity in reality. The lesson is that equality in voice is the key ingredient that ensures and sustains unity, particularly in diverse societies where historical differences or power imbalances might naturally exist. The political structure itself must actively work to mitigate the potential for the tyranny of the majority.
And this is, of course, deeply relevant today when we discuss things like power-sharing mechanisms in post-conflict states, or ensuring proportional representation for different ethnic or linguistic groups in diverse national settings. The failure to actively balance that representation often leads directly to political instability and eventually fragmentation, precisely because the excluded or underweighted group loses all faith in the fairness of the system.
Case 95 really demonstrates that the job of statecraft isn't just to govern, it's to constantly manage the inherent tensions that come with diversity by ensuring a persistent, equitable voice for all foundational groups within the state.
Wow. Okay, that completes our deep dive through these 10 foundational cases, 86 through 95. It's truly a remarkable blueprint when you lay it all out, moving from these high-level principles of liberty right down to the nuts and bolts of administrative transparency. Let's try a rapid-fire summary of the 10 key takeaways, just to reinforce that clear structure for you, listener.
Sounds good.
Okay, first, Case 86 taught us legitimate criticism has to be carefully institutionally distinguished from outright rebellion or sedition. Protect the speech, stop the destructive action. Second, Case 87 showed us that dissenting opinions, like those we saw at Uhud, are actually a political asset, a mercy that strengthens policy by stress testing it.
Right. Third, Case 88 mandated that political participation must be fair and actively inclusive of diverse groups like the Ansar and Muhajirun for the system to gain real legitimacy.
Fourth, Case 89 established that public engagement needs structure. It must be institutionalized, formalized. Relying on chance just isn't enough.
Fifth, Case 90, the Hudaybiyah example, demonstrated how constructive criticism, even when challenging, especially from loyal members, ultimately leads to better long-term policy and reform, even if it's uncomfortable initially.
And sixth, Case 91 confirmed that political rights aren't optional extras. They are essential, need to be secured, and are non-negotiable for stable governmental legitimacy.
Seventh, Case 92 defined those necessary systematic channels, petitioning, consultation, feedback systems that make citizen participation reliable and sustainable over the long term.
Eighth, Case 93 required that diverse political expression, even from outright critics, must be institutionally safeguarded because that diversity of opinion fundamentally enriches governance and builds resilience.
Ninth, Case 94 set that incredibly high but crucial standard administrative transparency, shown through things like publicly sharing records and treaties, is the most effective way to prevent internal mistrust and damaging speculation.
And finally, 10th, Case 95 solidified the idea that an equitable political voice across all significant internal groups, specifically managing that balance between the Ansar and Muhajirun, is the critical ingredient that ensures and sustains long-term communal unity, especially in a diverse state.
You know, what this historical model demonstrates when you put it all together is a really powerful synthesis. It shows that freedom of expression isn't meant to be a force of chaos or disorder. Instead, it's presented as a disciplined, highly regulated, and necessary political tool.
Regulated. Interesting.
Yes, in the sense that it comes with responsibilities and operates within defined structures. It's only successful, only truly real, when it's consistently paired with that responsibility, with institutional respect, and with a commitment to the foundational loyalty of the state or community. These mechanisms we've discussed are precisely what transition a potentially chaotic, individualistic right into a functional, civic-oriented freedom that actually benefits everyone.
I think that's the perfect synthesis. The sources really show that free speech isn't just random noise. It's meant to be the voice of conscience, but a conscience disciplined by truth and guided by justice.
Right.
And that principle, well, it requires continuous vigilance, continuous effort in any era. It's easy to celebrate free speech in the abstract, isn't it?
Very easy.
But it's much harder to commit to the specific systems of transparency laws like FOIA, the formal consultation mechanisms, the guarantees of equitable voice that actually make it constructive, make it fair, and ultimately make it unifying rather than divisive.
So as you reflect on these detailed historical structures we've explored today, the provocative closing thought we want to leave you with is this. Free expression is really a mechanism, not just an outcome. So what specific institutional system, not just a vague promise or a hope, can you implement today? Whether it's in your organization, your local community, maybe even how you think about national governance. What system can ensure dissenting voices are not just heard, but heard constructively? What systematic mechanism will you help build to ensure that the input you provide, or perhaps the input you receive, is disciplined by verifiable truth and guided by a sense of justice? Because that commitment to the system seems to be the real difference between just adding to the noise and engaging in genuine policy-changing dialogue.